Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. I'm your host, Steve BERG. I'm a partner at a New York City-based venture capital fund called Lytical Ventures. Lytical Ventures focuses on early-stage investments of companies that drive corporate intelligence. Corporate intelligence includes, for example, cybersecurity, data and analytics, and artificial intelligence. You can find us at www.lyticalventures.com. Lytical is spelled Lytical, Ventures, all one word, .com. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. We have a new production partner this season, VC Careers. If you're looking for a job in venture capital, join over 8,000 VCs and VC job hunters on John Gannon's VC Jobs email list. Visit johngannonblog.com/intangibles to learn more and to subscribe. Also, please find Intangibles on its new home on the web, www.intangiblespodcast.com. If you ask Dr. Francesca Gino to describe herself, she will say, "I'm a curious behavioral scientist, passionate about teaching and helping leaders make wiser decisions that can improve their lives and those around them." If you take the time to read her bio, you'll find out that she's a professor of business administration in the Negotiation, Organizations, and Markets Unit at Harvard Business School. She's also formerly affiliated with the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School with the Mind-Brain Behavior Initiative at Harvard and with the Behavioral Insight Group at Harvard Kennedy School. She teaches PhD course on behavioral approaches to decision-making and a PhD course on experimental methods. And she's written a couple of books, the most recent of which is called Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules. So, I think we can take Dr. Gino at her word when it comes to her ability to help leaders make wiser decisions. Today, Dr. Gino is going to help me help you become a rebel, or in my humble opinion, a evolutional thinker and an individualist. Welcome to Intangibles, Dr. Francesca Gino.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here.
That was an extensive Harvard-packed bio. Is there anything I left out of your bio that you'd much prefer be included to talk about the things that you care about?
A fun fact that I like to ride motorcycles.
So I knew that from your book. Do you ride the Indian motorcycles, or do you have a particular brand of motorcycles that you like?
It's easy to guess. Being a native of Italy, I love Ducati.
The Ducati bicycles or motorcycles. Yeah. But no love for Harley Davidsons?
Not really. I know that I'm crushing the heart of many, but I'm with the Ducatis.
Okay. That is a fun fact. And frankly, a little bit rebellious. Okay. So I looked in the Urban Dictionary for rebel. And it says, a rebel is a person who stands for their own personal opinions despite what anyone else says. I also looked up individualistic, which is kind of my own bent, not necessarily your bent. And the definition is a person who shows independence and individuality in his behavior, opinions, and actions. I'm saying that those sound kind of similar, but my guess is that if you A/B tested rebel versus individualistic, one of those probably does a little bit better in testing. So my question is, as you've defined it, do you see, is this a commonality, or in fact, do you really separate individualistic from rebel?
It's a very interesting question. I thought a lot about the two actually before, and I ended up with the label rebel for two main reasons. One is that when I think about the secret recipe of success, if you will, of the people I had the chance to study and the businesses that I visited and spent time with, the individualistic part was really mirrored and captured in one of the talents, which is authenticity, where people get to express their preferences and their views rather than covering them up. But it's one of 5 different talents. And when I think about the other ones, curiosity, novelty, and in particular perspective and diversity, the last 2 are really talents that allow us to be better collaborators, better at interacting with others. And so the definition of being individualistic seems as if not only you're being yourself, but you're also not listening very much or not open to the perspective of others, when in fact that is one of the things that rebels tend to do quite well. And the second reason is that when I think about the talents that I identified in my work and that I talk about in the book, they don't come easily to us because we're human beings. And so I like the label rebels because rebels fight against human tendencies that others just follow. And so I thought that it captured these abilities that they have of just not sticking to what others take easily, but rather fight against them. So if you think about authenticity, most of us just follow the expectations of others rather than bringing out our contributions and our ideas. Or when it comes to embracing the talent of novelty, most of us goes with what is familiar and comfortable rather than going for the new and novel and challenging. So rebels had this ability to fight against these tendencies in a way that made me think that rebel was a good label for them.
So what I hear is there's a hint of progressiveness in the rebel that doesn't necessarily exist, may or may not exist in the individual.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this tendency to be willing to fight such that what you end up with is better than what you have by not fighting.
Right. So, but it's that fighting is not aggression per se. But the willing to stand against is really what you're trying to talk about. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, if I think about aggressions, or another word that is often used when it comes to rebelliousness is arrogance. The rebels I met have humility rather than arrogance. And so arrogance is not part of the rebel life in the way I think.
That is fantastic. I mean, I know you don't know this because it literally just came out yesterday, but we literally just put out a podcast yesterday on intellectual humility. So I'm totally down with you as a quality required to find success, right? Whereas just kind of naked aggression is not that. All right. So you talked about the talents, right? These 5 talents. I'm going to go over a couple of them and dive into a couple with you. I know this one isn't the first talent you cover in the book, but I see...
okay, you don't have to follow the rules. I'm okay with that.
Oh, genius. I'm already on the path. This is fantastic. And we're only a couple minutes into the discussion. You're a fantastic teacher. Okay. But curiosity. And the reason I bring curiosity first is because I think in my mind, that's what sets a rebel heart in motion. I liken curiosity almost to hunger, right? It's propulsive. So let's talk about why curiosity is such an important piece of this standard that you're setting.
It is a really important talent because it's the type of skills, or it's the type of talent that allows us to not take things for granted, but start asking questions of the things that are there. And what is interesting is that one of the questions I receive when I talk about rebel talent is questions around the fact that rebels basically are not interested in existing processes or traditions. They're defiant, and they're not. If I think about a lot of rebels that I met, they actually studied traditions pretty carefully. In fact, one of the rebel principles is this idea of thriving at the basics. I'm going to give you an example. One of the inspiring rebels that I met is this Italian chef whose name is Massimo Bottura, and is the owner of a restaurant called Osteria Francescana, who back in 2016 became the best restaurant in the world. So a moment of Italian pride, since it was the first time for an Italian restaurant to reach the top of the list. And this year, in 2019, they're back at the top of the list, and they're also a 3 Michelin star restaurant. And what's interesting about this story that really caught my attention is that he is a person who reinvented traditional recipes, traditional Italian recipes. And if you know anything about Italians, we have a lot of rules when it comes to our cooking, like the fact that special sauces go with special type of pasta, all sorts of rules that we have there. And we also cherish our old ways. And he went to traditional Italian recipes, studied them very carefully, but then started asking questions with curiosity. He said, why is it that we do things this way? Why is it that we cook meat this way? Maybe it made sense 20 years ago, but it doesn't now. And it's that type of curiosity and asking questions that allowed him to not only study what was there, but also break away from traditions and invent his own recipes. And he's been very successful at that. But it required a lot of curiosity and I think a lot of courage.
So my recollection is this particular chef actually comes from fairly humble beginnings. Is that right?
Yeah, and he also is a person who at the beginning followed what his father wanted him to do. So he went to law school for 2 years and then he dropped out of law school. And at a certain point, one of his brothers said, look, there is this restaurant at the edge of town up for sales, and Massimo didn't have any experience whatsoever in running a business, and he didn't go to culinary school, but his answer was, why not? Cooking is something that I love to do, so let's give it a try. And that's his story.
So, one, immediately that ability to stand against. But two, what I like about that is you don't necessarily have to be starting from someplace of means or importance or thought. You can really start from any place and just start wondering, is this the best way? Is this the most efficient way? Is there another way to do it? So you touched on this notion of novel, right? Mm-hmm. And a good part of creativity and curiosity comes from the drive of human beings to find that which is new or which is novel. I would like to know, in terms of your research, how you relate curiosity to the natural human nature of finding the novel. How does that process work? And I think that's your example is a good example, but I think there's plenty more, and I know there's a number in the book as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the two are related for sure, but they're different. I think about curiosity, about that desire to really find answers to things that you don't know. And it's not just that you want to learn about them, you just need to know from a curiosity perspective. And so whether it's something related to your job or something completely outside of your job, that's what keeps you going. Now, curiosity might lead you to experience novel things or to engage in activities that you've not experienced before, but it's more about the general sense that you're not taking things for granted. You're always asking questions in a way that leads to explorations. Novelty and the talent for novelty is about really thinking differently about how to challenge yourself. No matter what job you have or no matter what you do in your personal life, thinking about ways in which, rather than following your usual comfortable routine, you can break out of that. So in the example I give, in the book, I give the example of how, this is now a few years back before having children, I decided to have the perfect gift for my husband for Christmas. And he's a tech guy. So you always love the last piece of technology or the last type of computer. And I instead bought for him a subscription, basically. I signed us up for a 10-week, 2-hour-a-week class in improv comedy. And that was my attempt for us to have a date with the unexpected every week. And I thought it'd be really interesting for us as a couple and us individually to do something new every week. And it was fascinating to see how he reacted to it and how I reacted to it. it's really interesting to challenge ourselves with something new. And again, it doesn't need to be as extreme as going to improv or comedy classes, but really finding tasks that stretch us a little bit in a way that interesting expands our skills and broaden our interests.
Okay, so I'm really glad that you explained that, because I'll tell you, I thought it was the reverse. I thought it was that our innate hunger for novelty is what drives curiosity, but clearly that you found the opposite is in fact the case.
Yeah.
Now, with regard to curiosity, one of the things that you mentioned in doing my research was that curious people tend to have larger and tighter social networks, which you know the audience here is a bunch of startup founders. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that would be a kind of a good thing.
It's a wonderful and really important thing, no matter what industry you're part of. It's data that comes from a study with colleagues at University of Toronto, where we collected data from a large bank in Canada. And what we found, it was that the best predictor of the type of diverse and large networks that people had at work was their curiosity. And then we followed up, because we were not only interested in the fact that people are born curious or not, or have more or less curiosity, but we were really interested in the question of how is it that organizations or leaders can foster more curiosity in people, no matter what their natural level of curiosity is. And so we started organizing why and what if type of days. So we conducted studies where if you were part of the study, you would receive on a weekly basis, twice a week actually, a message that asked you to ask a lot of why questions and what if questions as you go through the day. And what we were able to show is that the people who have those type of reminders as compared to people who have neutral type of reminders actually engage in networking more often in a way that is beneficial to their performance and career more generally. So really important finding, I think, about one of the things that curiosity does for us. It allows us to develop more relationship with others and tighter relationships, as you said.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think also embedded in that is, what you said about there, in fact, are ways to foster curiosity in people. So, I mean, I think just in general, people should feel good about the notion that they can become more curious, and that this curiosity is on the way on the path of being, a rebellious individual in society.
We probably all have those images of where we were little, or for people who have kids, that I do, of when your kids really can't stop asking why questions. Why is the sky blue? Or why do people give us receipts when we pay for things? Or why do we have to wear clothes? It's really interesting that that's how we're born. And in fact, if you look at the research, curiosity peaks at the age of 4 and 5. And then really sad finding, it declines steadily from there. So it seems like we go through life and lose that curiosity. And one of the opportunities I think organizations have is to make sure that they actually bring curiosity out rather than contributing to shutting it down.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I don't think that a person, in this case, founder or startup person, I don't think that person can be innovative or original without lots and lots of information intake beforehand. And I think that a high need for cognition, otherwise known as curiosity, I think that's the engine that facilitates that data intake. One thing I noticed about the thought process of rebels is that seems to be uncluttered by bias. I mean, in a rebel's mind, a fact is a fact. Everything gets taken at face value. And I particularly like that, because I think that is part and parcel of what I was talking about, intellectual humility. I think that's part and parcel of intellectual humility. Would you comment specifically, I know it's in the book, on the types of bias that tend to get absented from rebel thought? And so,
Yeah, I think you're capturing a beautiful aspect of rebel talent, and I very much agree with you. So there are all sorts of biases that we carry around as human beings, and they seem to be able to not be affected by them. So each of the talent is sort of related to an insidious bias that we carry around. So you can take, for instance, this idea of the talent for perspective. Now, we all have a preferred view of the world, or for any problems that comes our way or any decisions that we need to make, we usually have a perspective, and it's generally our own perspective that we favor. And what Rebel seems to be doing very easily is to stay open minded. And so they're much more willing and interested in the perspective of others, and they seem to not be affected about this idea that we look at the world from just one view, but rather they look at the world and every single problem in it from multiple perspectives. So that is certainly one bias that they don't seem to carry. They also are not as accepting of all the social rules that are generally passed on to us. And so biases like stereotypes or gender bias, or other type of biases that are related to different roles of people in society, they just don't seem to be affected by them. They fight against them constantly and always focus on information that proves them wrong.
so what I like about that, particularly in the world we live in today, is that allows for productive social discourse. And I think over time we've been slowly moving away from the ability to do that. So it's ever more important that people can have that, can remove that gender bias, diversity, seeking out diversity, removing stereotypes so that they can have a productive social discourse.
Yeah, and I think that the best rebels I've met are people who not only don't have such biases or fight against them, but they also make sure that the people who work with them also don't have those biases. So when I first visited Osteria Francescana, the restaurant that I was mentioning before, one of the things that really struck me is that despite the fact that you're in Italy and the type of cooking that is done at the restaurant is Italian cooking, the staff is incredibly diverse. So people come from all sorts of parts of the world. And Bottura really uses that as a real asset of the restaurant. So, for instance, every week he asks a person on the staff to cook the staff meal. And so what he's trying to show by asking people to do that is that the same ingredients can be used in many multiple ways that you wouldn't be aware of or know if you're just focused on the cooking that is from your own country. And so he has a really ingrained this idea of multiplicity of perspectives and really leveraging differences in everything that is done at the restaurant.
So the other side of that coin, and this is also goodness in my mind, is that rebels don't seem to mind conflict, and they don't really mind being proven wrong, do they?
No, they love to be challenged because they buy into the idea that being challenged and having conflicts can be productive and actually lead to better results. And what's interesting is that organizations that encourage rebelliousness or leaders that really encourage rebelliousness have put in mechanisms, if you will, that allow people to have productive conflicts. So one of the examples that comes to mind comes from Pixar. So obviously a very successful organizations, they really, in a sense, embrace conflict. You can think about their brainstorming sessions, but they use mechanisms that allow them to make sure that the conflict is productive rather than unproductive. So one of the techniques that they use is called plussing. It comes from improv comedy, where if you're building the scene, you're using the principle of yes and. So you take whatever is on the table and accept it, and then you can build on it, take the scene in a very different directions, but you're not criticizing or judging the idea or shutting them down. You're building on it constructively. And so productive conflicts come from the use of techniques like that, whether you call them plussing or yes and. that allow you to not judge idea or shut them down, but have a productive and constructive conversations about them, even with a lot of disagreement.
So what I like about this is what it actually says about the ego of the rebellious person, right? The ego feels like it's just not there, or it's not a significant thing, which, by the way, I think if you ask a lot of people, do rebels have big egos? They'd probably say, yeah, of course they do. It's just the opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, one of the main motivations of writing this book is to put the message out there that I think we think of rebels the wrong way. So I collected all sorts of adjectives when I've been in organizations asking people to tell me the way they think about rebels. And so people say show-offs, people who slow us down, the troublemakers, and that's not what effective rebels being an effective rebel means. So it's breaking rules to hold them and others back, but not for the sake of breaking rules, but being thoughtful about it and not with arrogance. In fact, as you were saying, intellectual humility is something that rebels carry with them. They think about gaining experience and knowledge, not as a signal that they know a lot, but as a signal that there is more to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we'll probably end up, as I can see other traits converging on that, and I think we'll probably end up touching that a little bit more in just a second. I'd like to move on to the talent of nonconformity. Obviously, not a lot of rebels out there that, in fact, are conformists. It's kind of part of the definition. But if you could quickly mention what nonconformity means to you, and then kind of dig in why nonconformity is so hard for the average person to practice.
So we are all, what being nonconformist is about is really about the talent for authenticity. So making sure that you approach situations in which you're bringing yourselves out, your preferences, your ideas, even when others are going in a different directions. And part of the struggle that we all feel is that when we interact with others, we want to be accepted by them. And so often the next step in that reasoning is we need to conform to their ideas. We need to follow what they're saying rather than expressing our own views if they're not in line with theirs. And so that's the mistake, if you will, that we tend to make. Feeling and being authentic is incredibly powerful. This is something that my colleagues and I explored in all sorts of contexts. We look at entrepreneurs making pitches and looked at whether the pitches were more or less authentic. And what we found is that this is data from pitching competitions. But what we found is that when entrepreneurs were more genuine and authentic in their pitching, they were 3 times more likely to get funding for their entrepreneurial ideas. So authenticity pays off in a lot of contexts. And sometimes being authentic means playing to our strength, which again is not as common as we might think. Think about our life at work. We often dwell on weaknesses or overinvest in weaknesses because we learn that there are gaps that we need to fill, when in fact, if we play to our strength, we would feel more authentic and be better able to use our talents.
So in the hands of someone who is a transformational leader or an innovator, nonconformity doesn't really exist for the sake of just being different. Rather, nonconformity is the result of original thought on what it might be better or more efficient or more artistic, given the prevailing circumstances, and that is in and of itself the authenticity that you're talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, and you said it beautifully. It goes back to this idea of not taking things for granted just because others are following the traditions or the rules, but thinking thoughtfully about this and see what your spin might be on it. Again, if you think back to the story of Massimo Bottura, that's exactly what he did. Everybody was accepting making ravioli or lasagna in the same old ways, and he looked at what went into it and started questioning it in a way that allowed him, yes, to be a nonconformist, but in a way that paid off and led him to all sorts of innovations in the kitchen.
So in your book, there's there's a series of rules for rebel leadership. One of those rules is learn everything, forget everything. And it seems to me that that's actually what you're touching on right now, isn't it?
Yeah, it's having the willingness to really look at the traditions that are there, the rules that are there, the processes that are there prior to reinventing them. And again, this is something of a misconceptions. We think of rebels as people who just are defiant for the sake of it, and they're not. They're very thoughtful in the way they think about rules that should be broken.
Yeah, I mean, I think about, I honestly think that I would adjust that expression, learn everything, forget everything. I think that you cannot truly create efficiency or innovation until you know everything about the thing, and then interject a new idea into that that creates the next original idea. Essentially, you're kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. So I wouldn't say forget everything. I would say learn everything, question everything.
That's a good language. I wish you were with me as I wrote the book. There is an interesting business in a totally different context where I think most people wouldn't expect to find a rebelliousness that really, I think, show how this idea could work. And it's a fast food chain in Tennessee and West Virginia. They're called the Pulse Sudden Service. Really remarkable. If you look at any measure of performance, they beat the competitions by far. So revenue per square, they do better than McDonald's, Burger Kings, and Wendy's. Now, they don't have thousands of stores. They have about 30 of them. But it's also interesting to think about how they think about this learning idea and the investment they make in people. So if at a place like McDonald's, people usually receive about 2 hours of training per station, at Pulse Sudden Service, people receive 135 hours of training per station. So that is really learning everything.
Yeah.
And then the idea is that by making people expert in what they do, they're going to have the peace of mind to think about what it is that they can innovate because they know the processes so well.
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I've got to say, did you just offer me a job as a research associate for a Harvard professor? Because if you did, I'm there. I'm out of here. I'll be there on the next flight. If not, then I guess we can continue with this discussion. So, I mean, I've always thought of nonconformity as kind of a virtuous cycle, right? Because broadly, that cycle is those who don't know us expect us to conform, right? When they see nonconformity, they assign it status because they assume it requires some knowledge, power, wealth, whatever it is to be able to have a nonconformist stance. But then that external status that we get assigned, it's typically greater than the status that I myself might assign myself based on knowing me, right? But it's that mismatch, right, between the external perception and the internal perception that leads the individual into actually developing more confidence. So now I've got more confidence, and that added confidence in turn fuels my desire and my willingness to be nonconformist.
I agree that it's a virtual cycle, and the different parts that you talk about are nicely reinforcing one another. So very, very true. And what is interesting is that sometimes we have the wrong perceptions about the power of being a nonconformist. So we might think that by behaving in ways that are not conforming to expectations, we're going to obtain all sorts of negative evaluations, and instead it's just the opposite. I tried it out in my own work. There was a class that I taught at the executive level one time, and it was 2 classes actually back to back to the same group of people, but divided into class because there were too many. And I went in teaching some materials, and the only thing that I changed in between the 2 classes were my pair of shoes. So I was wearing a nice suit, and I went from a pair of very formal leather shoes to a pair of red sneakers. And then I asked people in both classes to answer questions about what they thought of my status and on my influence. And what is interesting is that on things like my consulting rate or my influence within HBS, people thought of me as having a higher status when I was teaching in a suit and red sneakers rather than the formal pair of shoes. So you're right. We gain more status in the eyes of others when we are behaving in non-conforming ways, but that also gives us confidence. I certainly felt more confident when I was teaching in my sneakers than in my shoes. And then fascinated by that experience, I actually backed it up with research. And it seems that it's a through experience that we have. We're more confident and less anxious when we're behaving in non-conforming ways.
Right. But by the way, I'm sure you realize that was a complete setup, right? Because I just had you say that we can learn to be more nonconformist, which is, again, kind of what I'm angling for here, that the founders, whoever might be listening, can actually improve these qualities within themselves. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, you don't have to be born a rebel, but it's all a matter of doing a few things differently, like wearing red sneakers in formal settings, but also committing to rebelliousness more broadly, really committing to the idea that it's okay of exploring ways of being in the world that might at first feel wrong or possibly even destructive, that it is okay, and becoming comfortable with that idea. But yes, I am not a rebel. I am certainly trying to learn about how to be an effective one. And the experience of trying little things out actually inspired me to create guidelines on how to live like a rebel for a week. So there is a document on the book website that people can check out, which is about 7 days of rule breaking.
Nice.
And yeah, if you're like me after trying the rebel life, you won't want to go back.
So I always ask a question at the end. What are the resources? You've just answered that question. I'm checking it off the list. I want to kind of explore the authenticity piece that goes with it, because you mentioned that a couple of times, and I directed you away to kind of stay with nonconformity. When I think about authenticity, I can't see how a rebellious spirit could end up as anything but authentic. I think more to me, the question is, why, and you started to touch on this, why is that authenticity so important of a character trait?
It's really important for the type of behaviors that it inspires us to engage in. So I mentioned one earlier. One way of being authentic is to playing to our strengths rather than dwelling on our weaknesses. Another way of being authentic that often doesn't come easily to people is to make ourselves vulnerable. So even when it comes to interacting with others, rather than focusing on our successes, just sharing our failures or the way we made mistakes in the past or the ways we are not perfect. So that's usually the part that surprises people when it comes to thinking about rebels, is this idea of being willing and able to make yourself vulnerable. There is a story that I share in the book, which is the story of a really wonderful coach, a basketball coach. And it's the story of April 23, 2003, where the coach was ready to cheer up his team to victory in the NBA championship. And right before the game started, there is a 14-year-old girl who stands in the middle of the arena with 20,000 fans also ready to watch the game and millions of viewers from home. And she starts singing the national anthem. And a couple of lines into the song, it's clear that she doesn't remember the words. And what you see in the video is the coach, Maurice Cheeks, going over, putting an arm around her shoulders, taking the microphone and putting it close to her mouth and helping her sing. And the most striking part of the video is that if you listen to his singing, his voice is horrible. It clearly is not one of his strengths. And yet is there to help out a person in need. He is very willing to make himself vulnerable, even in a context where there are millions of people watching what he does. That is something, and it's hard to do, but Rebel seems to find easy feeling and being authentic, actually maximizing the value of authenticity. And one way of doing that is, again, making themselves vulnerable.
Yeah. So people broadly, they have a positive physiological response to people who are authentic, just as they have a negative physiological response to people that they don't think are authentic.
That's exactly right. But most people don't have that intuition. So think about a context where authenticity can be really powerful, which is job interviews, or even pitching ideas to venture capitalists. Often we believe that the thing that we should be doing is try to read others' mind and cater to their interests or cater to their expectations. Or in job interviews, some of the answers that I love the most is looking at answers that people give to the question of what's one of your weaknesses. And so usually the answer is I'm too much of a perfectionist. Those are not real weaknesses.
Right.
And people don't realize that being authentic in contexts like those can be really powerful, that people really appreciate it and evaluate us positively rather than negatively.
So, you mentioned the vulnerability. Authenticity also includes uniqueness, of course, and honesty. But it seems to me that it takes an awful lot of effort for us to understand what our authentic selves really stand for. You really have to do like a lot of soul searching and rank ordering and categorizing and thinking about that. Why is it so hard for us to understand what it is about ourselves that's authentic?
I don't think many of us take the time for reflection more generally. And so one of the things that I think we don't do is asking ourselves questions like, what's really unique about me, or what are my strengths, how I could best play to my strengths in my job. I don't think that comes that natural to us. In fact, my colleagues and I conducted studies in which we make people think through those questions, and it's incredibly powerful. We did a study in India in the business process outsourcing side of the business of Wipro Technologies. And we were asking people who joined the organizations to go through that process on their first day at the company during the welcoming sessions. So some people went through the process, they reflected on their strengths and what's unique about them, and then how they could bring those out into their jobs. And some people went through the regular welcoming system at Wipro. And what was fascinating is that when we looked at things like job satisfaction or performance on the job or retention rates, those variables were all much more positive for the people who had the chance to start the job by reflecting on their unique points and strengths. So I just don't think we realize the value of taking the time to think through what those are for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. But
it's hard.
Yeah, but the flip side, though, is how, if you determine in yourself what is authentic, how can you possibly be a conformist? You can't be anything but a nonconformist once you've decided what is authentic about you.
I think that a lot of people are afraid to be who they are or to express their ideas. Think about common situations that I see a lot of in organizations. Sometimes I sit like a fly just watching meetings happen, and I see a lot of meetings where it's clear that there are people who are disagreeing with what is being discussed, but they just nod their heads. Mm-hmm. Especially when there are differences in the status of the people sitting at the table. It's just hard to bring our ideas, our preferences, our contributions forward. We're often afraid, and that's why we cover up rather than being authentic.
Mm. So, all right, we've got curiosity, we've got nonconformity, we've got authenticity. You started to talk about perspective and diversity. Now, interestingly, I think that perspective and diversity are infused into the topics of curiosity, nonconformity, and authenticity. But I wanted to give you the chance of kind of breaking those out and explaining why you separated them, if you want to. If you don't want to, that's completely fine. But it seemed worthwhile, from the perspective of, one, why are these regarded as traits? Two, are they in fact separate and distinct, or are they just worth calling out in the context of the other three?
So, very good question. So, when I think about the five talents, they are definitely distinct. I think that there are uh, interesting properties that are unique to all the talents individually. But what is interesting is that they clearly reinforce one another.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, when I think about a lot of the rebels that I talk about in the book, they tend to have a lot of these talents and rely on them quite often. Now, to see clear distinctions in the talents, one of the things that maybe might be fun for you if you have not done that, but also for people listening in, is going to the book website. It's rebeltalents.org. There is a free assessment that I created where you're asked to answer 30 different questions and then you're told which type of rebels you are. And it's interesting that there are four different rebel types, and the types that I identified are types that are based on which of these five talents come more easily to you. So there are some people who have a type called a pirate, where the five talents seems to be present quite often in their lives. But then there are other types where maybe one or the two talents seems to be more prominent, but not the other three. And so, yes, they can definitely reinforce one another, but they're actually quite unique and distinct.
I appreciate you giving the answer to that. So when I think about all five, in some form or fashion, and I'm asking this in a way that hopefully you'll either correct me or reinforce my thinking. All of them in form or fashion come back to originality and courage. And what I mean by that is, first, the wisdom and effort to define what is unique, and then the conviction to espouse and employ it daily in what it is that we do. Correct? Not correct? Partially correct?
I think it's pretty accurate. Sometimes we joke about HBS professors, and I'm one of them, about the fact that we often think in terms of 2x2s. But when it comes to rebel talent, one of the 2x2s that I think is helpful is thinking about the following two dimensions: that you yourself are a person who embrace rebelliousness. So you might be high or low on this dimension. So imagine that is your x-axis. And then the y-axis is the leaders you work with or the organization you work for really encourage rebelliousness or not. And so you're low and high. And what is interesting about this 2x2 in my mind is that the perfect world is one where you embrace rebelliousness and also your organization encourages it. But I meet a lot of people who feel that they work for leaders or organizations that don't really encourage rebelliousness, leaders that seems to be afraid of really fostering rebelliousness. And what I always say is that we ourselves can do a lot in terms of using these talents more often in our life. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason, the big motivation of writing this book is giving people ideas on how to do just that. So I don't think that we should be waiting for others to really encourage us to rebel. I think that there is a lot that we can do ourselves using a lot of the ideas that we even discussed today. So you were saying we don't take the time to reflect on what makes us unique or what our strengths are. That's one way to get started on using our authenticity more often. And so I think there is a lot that we can do ourselves to make sure that we rely on these talents more often.
I fully agree. Okay, this is home stretch. Final three questions. The first one, I personally think that we covered a great deal of ground, but what would you say, if there's anything that is a glaring omission or something that we really need to add into this discussion to make sure that we've got a relatively complete picture here?
One of the things that I would say is I'm hoping with the book that people will take some ideas about the value of being rebellious, not only in their work life, but also in their personal lives. So when I think about what I learned from this project or the things that I do differently now because of working on this big project, part of them are in my approach to work, but part of them are in my approach of being a partner to my husband or being a friend to my friends or even being a parent to my children. So I think there are lots of opportunities to think about rebelliousness, not only in our life at work, but also in our life more generally.
Yeah. Yeah. Adjusting your consciousness in one part of your life, but not in your other parts of your life seems a little unnatural. So I would agree with that. Okay. So the second question is always, what are the other resources? But you've mentioned at least two, either if there's repeats or if there's additional resources that people who really want to stretch out a little bit more in terms of their thinking about this and maybe practice it a little bit more that they might go to.
Yeah, so the best resource to use is the book website. It's rebeltalents.org. And under the section Learn More, there are a few different documents. One of them is the top 10 reasons to be a rebel. So that is for people who are feeling a little bit uncomfortable if they read the book or heard about the book and they don't know whether it's worthwhile doing so. So I wrote about 10 reasons why I think it's a good idea. And then there is this document, these guidelines about 7 days of rule breaking. So again, it's just to get started on this journey of being more rebellious in a way that can be productive and constructive rather than destructive.
So I'm going to throw out there that anybody who gives me feedback on having done the 7 days of rebelliousness, I'm going to promise to share that with Dr. Gino. So I've now assigned it to the listeners.
I think that would be wonderful, and I'd be happy to hear about their experiences and their stories. And then, as I said, there is one more resource, which is the Rebel Test, so the Rebel Assessment. So for people who are curious to know what their type is when it comes to rebelliousness, they might find the assessment to be helpful. It gives you feedback on your rebel type, but also tips on things that you might be doing differently going forward.
Okay. Rebel hacks, if you will.
Exactly.
And so as a business professor, do you like to actually be found on social media, or do you have like all you can handle and you prefer not to be found? Because if so, let us know where people can follow the progress and other work that you do.
I love to interact with people who are interested in these ideas and in the research that I do. So I am on LinkedIn, I am on Twitter, and I am pretty good at responding to emails. So I am always happy to engage in conversations about these ideas. So when I think about my level of happiness and how I motivate my own existence is in making sure that these ideas are out there and are helping people in some ways. And so part of that mission is making myself available to hearing stories or helping people really make sense of the ideas that I write about.
Perfect. You don't happen to remember your Twitter handle, do you?
I do. It's at Francesca Gino.
There you go. Guess what? That's it.
That is wonderful. You had some very good questions.
I want to thank you very much.
I am the one who wants to thank you very much.
I mean, I find this it's a complex topic. It's very valuable to sort through it, the nuance associated with it. And I think, for founders in particular, this is a pretty big driver. So I think you've imported a lot of knowledge, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Steve. This is wonderful that you're saying that, and I'm hoping that the ideas are going to make their ways into the life of a lot of founders.
Cheers. Thanks. This has been Intangibles. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd like to thank VC Careers for their support, and I'd also like to thank Ben Glawe, who's a fantastic sound engineer. It is a privilege to work with him. Find him on Twitter. His handle is @visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode. I'm your host, Steve BERG.